She woke up expecting another exhausting morning of survival, empty fridge, unpaid bills, and a future that felt smaller every day. Instead, the smell of fresh coffee filled her tiny apartment. The CEO of a billion-dollar company stood in her kitchen, calmly making breakfast, as if he belonged there. Her mind raced between fear, confusion, and anger, but nothing prepared her for what he said next. One sentence, low, deliberate, and impossible to ignore, stopped her breath and froze her body in place. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't blindness. It was the beginning of a truth she was never supposed to uncover. And what followed would expose power, secrets, and a betrayal so shocking it would change her life forever. Stay until the end, because the reason he was there will leave you stunned. She had learned to wake up before the sun, not because she wanted to, but because life demanded it. Mornings were the only hours that belonged to her before the world began asking for things she didn't have: money, patience, strength. Her small apartment sat above a laundromat on a street most people avoided, unless they had no other choice. The walls were thin, the windows old, and the air always carried the faint smell of detergent and hot pavement. It wasn't the home she had imagined for herself, but it was the only place that had stayed when everything else walked away. She moved quietly through her days for one simple reason. Noise attracted attention, and attention often came with consequences. As a black single mother, she had learned early that the world watched her more closely than it did others, waiting for her to slip, to fail, to confirm expectations that had been written for her long before she ever had a chance to write her own. Every decision felt heavier because it wasn't just hers, it belonged to her child, too. Her son was the center of her universe, the one reason she kept pushing, even when exhaustion made her vision blur. She measured her days by his needs: school lunches, worn-out shoes, permission slips she signed with a pen borrowed from work. She stretched meals, reused what others would throw away, and learned how to smile convincingly, even when anxiety nodded. Her chest. To the outside world, she looked functional. Inside, she was always calculating how long before the rent was due, how many hours she could afford to miss if her son got sick, how much dignity she could trade without losing herself completely. Her job was never meant to be permanent. It was one of those positions people fell into when ambition met reality and reality won. The building she worked in was massive, polished, and cold, rising over the city like a monument to power. She cleaned offices that were larger than her entire apartment, wiping down desks where decisions were made that would never benefit someone like her. Every night, she emptied trash bins filled with half-finished lunches and expensive packaging, reminders of how uneven the world truly was. She knew the company's name long before she ever stepped inside its doors. Everyone did. It was one of those corporations people spoke about, with a mix of awe and resentment: innovative, ruthless, untouchable. The CEO was a myth, more than a man, a figure whose face appeared on magazine covers and business panels, always framed as a visionary. To her, he was just another distant symbol of a system that thrived, while people like her struggled quietly beneath it. There was something about the building that unsettled her. It wasn't just the security checkpoints, or the way executives never made eye contact. It was the feeling that the walls remembered everything that happened inside them, that secrets lived in the corners of those pristine offices. She often felt watched, even when she was alone, as if her presence itself was an intrusion. Her life outside of work offered little relief. The neighborhood was loud, unpredictable, and unforgiving. Sirens were as common as birdsong, and trust was a luxury few could afford. She kept her circle small, no room for people who might bring chaos. when she was already balancing on the edge. Friends drifted away over time, worn down by their own struggles or scared off by responsibility. Family existed mostly in memory, scattered by circumstances no one liked to talk about. Nights were the hardest. After her son fell asleep, she would sit at the small kitchen table and let the weight of the day settle into her bones. She replayed conversations she wished she'd handled differently, imagined futures that felt just out of reach. Sometimes she allowed herself to dream nothing extravagant. Just stability, safety, a life where she didn't have to constantly brace for impact. Other times, she scolded herself for even thinking that way. Hope, she had learned, could be dangerous if it wasn't carefully managed. There were moments at work when she sensed something was off, though she couldn't explain why. Files left out when they shouldn't have been. Meetings that ran late into the night, followed by tense silences the next day. Once, she found a document in the trash that made her pause, not because she understood it, but because it felt important. She didn't keep it. She didn't ask questions. Survival had taught her that curiosity could be costly. The CEO remained, a distant presence, spoken about in hushed tones by management, and admired from afar by those who believed proximity to power meant safety. She had never seen him in person, only in photographs and on screens. Yet, his influence was everywhere, in the policies that cut hours without warning, in the pressure to work faster without complaint, in the unspoken understanding that everyone beneath him was replaceable. Despite everything, she took pride in her work. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. She showed up on time, did her job well, and kept her head down. She believed that if she followed the rules long enough, life might eventually ease its grip on her. It was a quiet faith, fragile but persistent. The night before everything changed felt ordinary in the way only hindsight could make cruel. She tucked her son into bed, promised him a better day tomorrow, and cleaned the kitchen one last time. The apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rumble of traffic. She went to sleep with the familiar ache of fatigue, unaware that the morning would shatter every assumption she had about her place in the world. Because while she believed her life was invisible to people like him, something had already been set in motion. Decisions had been made in rooms she would never enter, involving names she never expected to hear, spoken alongside hers. The distance between her reality and his was about to collapse in the most unsettling way possible. And when she opened her eyes the next morning, the line between power and vulnerability, between observer and participant, would vanish, completely forcing her into a story she never agreed to be part of, and a truth that would no longer allow her to remain silent. The first thing she noticed wasn't fear. It was disbelief. Her mind refused to accept what her eyes were processing, as if reality itself had glitched overnight. The smell of food still lingered in the air, warm and deliberate, clashing violently with the cold routine of her mornings. Nothing in her life happened without effort or warning. Yet this moment had arrived, fully formed, uninvited, and impossibly calm. She stood, frozen, her instincts screaming while her thoughts lagged behind. This wasn't a dream. The apartment looked the same: scuffed floor, chipped counter, unpaid bills stacked neatly near the sink. That familiarity made the presence feel even more wrong. A man like him did not belong in a space like this. Power was supposed to keep its distance. Wealth was meant to be protected by gates, security, and silence. And yet, here it was, standing in her kitchen, as if it had always been there. As the shock settled into her chest, something darker crept in: fear, sharpened by awareness. This wasn't random. Men like that didn't move without reason. They didn't cross invisible boundaries by accident. Every step they took was calculated, every risk assessed long before it was ever felt. The realization pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. If he was here, it meant something had already gone wrong. Her thoughts raced backward through recent weeks, searching for a mistake. Had she said something she shouldn't have? Touched something that didn't belong to her? She replayed her shifts in her head, remembered the late nights, the strange tension in the building, the moments when she felt like a shadow moving through someone else's secrets. The memory of that discarded document returned uncomfortably, sharp. She hadn't understood it, but understanding wasn't always required for guilt to be assigned. The imbalance of the situation was undeniable. He held the kind of authority that could erase lives, quietly, efficiently, without consequence. She, on the other hand, had spent years proving she was harmless, just to survive. The difference between them wasn't just money or status, it was the luxury of being believed. If something went wrong, his version of events would become truth long before hers was ever heard. As the seconds stretched, she felt the walls closing in, not physically, but psychologically. Her home had always been her refuge, imperfect but safe. Now it felt exposed, compromised, as though its thin walls could no longer protect her from the reach of people who existed far above her reality. The idea that he knew where she lived, knew her routine, knew enough to appear without warning, made her skin prickle with unease. Her son slept in the next room, blissfully unaware of the shift occurring just beyond the door. The thought grounded her and terrified her at the same time. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about her anymore. It carried consequences that could ripple outward, touching the one thing she had worked so hard to protect. The instinct to shield him flared fiercely, overriding her confusion and forcing her to focus. She became acutely aware of how small she felt, not in size, but in position. Years of being overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed had trained her to read power dynamics instantly. This was power unrestrained, stepping directly into her personal space without permission. The audacity of it burned quietly beneath her fear. He hadn't knocked. He hadn't announced himself. He had entered as though access to her life was something he had earned. Her mind began connecting dots she had previously ignored. The subtle changes at work, the sudden interest from management in areas no one had cared about before, the way her name had been spoken, recently not casually, but carefully. At the time, she had dismissed it as paranoia, a byproduct of exhaustion. Now, it felt like foresight she hadn't trusted. What unsettled her most wasn't his presence, but his calm. There was no urgency, no aggression, no visible concern for how inappropriate the situation was. That composure suggested preparation. It suggested that this moment had been rehearsed, that outcomes had already been imagined and controlled. Calm, she realized, was a weapon in the hands of someone who had never been forced to feel powerless. As her initial shock faded, anger began to surface slow, controlled, and dangerous. Not explosive, but steady. Anger rooted in the injustice. For it all. The idea that her life could be disrupted so casually by someone who would never understand what it took for her just to exist. That anger didn't make her reckless. It made her alert. She studied everything, the way he occupied the space, the confidence with which he moved, the absence of hesitation. This wasn't a man worried about consequences. This was a man used to rewriting them. And that realization shifted something inside her. Fear alone wouldn't save her. Silence wouldn't either. The tension followed her throughout the morning, clinging to her even after the immediate shock passed. Time moved strangely, stretching and compressing in ways that left her disoriented. When she eventually stepped outside, The world looked the same. Cars passing, neighbors rushing, life continuing without pause. That normalcy felt cruel. How could everything look so unchanged when her reality had fractured so completely? At work, the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Eyes lingered just a second too long. It was subtle enough to be deniable, but unmistakable to someone who had spent her life reading rooms for survival. She was no longer invisible. And being seen in a place like that was dangerous. She sensed it in the way supervisors avoided her gaze, in the way security seemed more alert when she passed. The building that once felt impersonal now felt hostile, as if it were watching her closely, waiting for her to confirm something it already believed. The power structure she had quietly existed beneath was tightening. Her thoughts returned again and again to the same question. Why her? She wasn't powerful, she wasn't influential, she was careful. And yet, somehow, she had become important enough to warrant attention from the very top. That contradiction gnawed at her, pushing her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about her place in the system. As the day wore on, fragments of understanding began to surface. She remembered moments when she had been present without being acknowledged, overheard things not meant for her ears simply because no one thought she mattered enough to listen. That invisibility, once a shield, had become a liability. Somewhere along the line, it had allowed her to see something she wasn't supposed to see. By the time she returned home, exhaustion weighed on her like a physical burden. The apartment no longer felt like a sanctuary. Every shadow seemed suspect, every sound amplified by her heightened awareness. She checked locks she had never doubted before, stood still to listen to the silence, and wondered how many lines had already been crossed without her knowledge. Sleep came reluctantly, haunted by the understanding that her life had shifted onto a path she couldn't step away from. Whatever truth was moving toward her was deliberate and unavoidable. She sensed that the calm before the storm was ending, replaced by something far more dangerous: expectation. Because when power shows itself, it rarely does so without intention. And the closer she came to understanding why he had entered her world so casually, the more she realized that the real threat wasn't what he knew about her, but what she was about to learn about him. The truth didn't arrive gently. It crashed into her awareness, piece by piece, each fragment stripping away another layer of denial. By the time everything aligned, there was no room left to pretend this was a misunderstanding or a coincidence. What had begun as quiet unease had transformed into something undeniable. She was standing at the center of a storm that powerful people had worked very hard to keep invisible. The pressure reached its peak on a day that was designed to look ordinary. The company moved forward with a public-facing event meant to showcase transparency, progress, and leadership. The building buzzed with preparation, polished smiles, and carefully rehearsed narratives. To the outside world, it was a celebration of success. To her, it felt like a stage set for a performance she hadn't agreed to be part of. She felt it the moment she walked in: the shift in energy, the subtle tightening of control. Every movement was monitored. Every step felt deliberate. This wasn't about routine anymore. It was about containment. Somewhere between the pristine floors and the glass walls, the illusion of safety finally collapsed. The realization struck her with brutal clarity. She had become a liability, not because she had spoken out, not because she had exposed anything, but because she existed in the wrong place at the wrong time and had seen too much without being meant to. Her presence alone threatened narratives worth millions. And people at that level didn't wait for problems to grow, they erased them. What she uncovered wasn't loud or dramatic on its surface. It was buried in patterns, omissions, and decisions that quietly harmed the most vulnerable while enriching the few. Policies designed to look fair while exploiting loopholes. Public promises that masked private gains. And at the center of it all stood the man who had crossed into her home, as if it were an extension of his own authority. The CEO wasn't reckless. That was the mistake people made when they underestimated him. He was precise, calculated. Every move was designed to maintain control while appearing benevolent. His presence in her apartment hadn't been intimidation, had been assessment. He needed to see who she was before deciding how to handle her. That knowledge burned through her fear and replaced it with something sharper: resolve, when the confrontation finally arrived. It didn't happen in a dark room or behind closed doors. It unfolded in plain sight, surrounded by the very systems meant to protect reputations. That was the irony of it all. Power relied on silence, but it also relied on spectacle. And once the spectacle began, it was impossible to contain. The moment felt surreal. Time slowed as attention shifted, not abruptly, but gradually, like a tide pulling focus in one direction. She felt the weight of being seen, truly seen, for the first time. Not as background, not as labor, but as a variable that hadn't been accounted for. Every risk she had ever avoided pressed down on her at once. This was the point of no return. The space where fear and courage collided. She understood what was at stake: not just her job, not just her safety, but her future and her child's. Stability. The system was betting she would choose survival over truth. They were wrong. The exposure wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was methodical, undeniable, and devastating, precisely because it unfolded within the framework of their own roles. The narratives they had built began to crack under their own weight. Documents surfaced, timelines unraveled. Patterns became impossible to ignore. The room shifted from confidence to confusion, from control to quiet panic. The CEO's carefully constructed image faltered not in anger, but in restraint. That restraint spoke volumes. It revealed a man who had always expected outcomes to bend in his favor, now confronted with a variable he could not neutralize without drawing attention to himself. The very visibility he relied on had become a liability. What made the moment so powerful wasn't humiliation, it was inevitability. The understanding that no amount of influence could fully erase what had already been seen. The truth didn't need permission to exist anymore. It had stepped into the light and refused to leave. She felt the shift internally before she saw it externally. Years of shrinking, of making herself small to avoid consequences, dissolved in an instant. She wasn't fearless, but she was steady, and that steadiness became contagious. Others began to notice, to question, to re-examine things they had previously accepted without thought. The power dynamic inverted, quietly but completely. The man who had once entered her life unannounced now found himself subject to scrutiny he could not control. The systems he had manipulated so effortlessly began turning inward, protecting themselves. Instead of him, loyalty evaporated. Silence fractured. For her, the moment carried no triumph, only clarity. She understood that justice was rarely clean or satisfying, but accountability, even imperfect, mattered. Especially when it disrupted cycles designed to crush people like her without consequence. As the confrontation reached its peak, she felt something unexpected: relief. Not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because she had reclaimed ownership of her story. No one else was speaking for her anymore. No one else was deciding what she deserved to know or how much space she was allowed to take up. When it was over, when the room settled into stunned quiet and the performance finally collapsed, she stood exactly where she was. Unshaken, The cost had been high. The risk had been real. But the truth had done what power never could. It leveled the ground. And in that moment, as the carefully built illusion of invincibility shattered around the very man who had underestimated her, one thing became unmistakably clear. The system had failed to account for her resilience, and that oversight had changed everything. The aftermath didn't explode the way people expect justice to. There were no dramatic arrests in the moment, no instant collapse of an empire. Instead, the consequences unfolded slowly, deliberately, like a structure cracking from the inside until it could no longer hold its own weight. That quiet unraveling was more unsettling than chaos could have ever been. In the days that followed, the company's polished image began to dull. Public confidence wavered as questions multiplied, and answers came carefully measured, filtered through legal language. The public relations strategies. The CEO remained visible, but the certainty that once surrounded him was gone. Every appearance now carried tension, every statement scrutinized for what it avoided, as much as for what it said. Power, once effortless, had become defensive. For the silence after the storm was the hardest part to adjust to. Cha had spent so long bracing for impact that stillness felt unnatural. Her routine no longer offered the comfort it once had. The building she worked in became a place of transition rather than permanence. People looked at her differently, with admiration, but with awareness. She was no longer invisible, and that came with both relief and risk. The system didn't punish her openly. It didn't need to. Subtle shifts did the work instead. Opportunities disappeared. Conversations ended when she entered rooms. The unspoken message was clear. She had disrupted something sacred. But this time, the weight of that message didn't crush her. She had already crossed the threshold where fear held power over her decisions. Support arrived from unexpected places. Not loud, not public, but real. Individuals who had once remained silent began to speak in quieter ways, sharing experiences, validating concerns, acknowledging patterns they had learned to ignore. It wasn't solidarity born of bravery. It was solidarity born of recognition. Her story had given shape to doubts many people carried but never voiced. At home, the shift was even more profound. The apartment that had once felt compromised slowly reclaimed its sense of safety. She reorganized it, not out of necessity, but intention. Small changes, new curtains, rearranged furniture, moments of quiet that belonged only to her signaled something deeper. She was no longer waiting for permission to feel secure. She was creating it. Her son noticed the change before anyone else. Children always do. He sensed the difference in her posture, the way her shoulders no longer carried the same constant tension. She became more present, less distracted by calculations of survival. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine a future without immediately preparing for its collapse. The broader impact continued to ripple outward. Investigations expanded beyond what had initially been revealed. The narrative shifted from isolated misconduct to systemic failure. Policies once praised for efficiency were reevaluated. Decisions that had been quietly accepted were questioned. The illusion of flawless leadership fractured, replaced by a more uncomfortable truth. Harm had been normalized because it was profitable. The CEO's fall wasn't dramatic, but it was definitive. Influence weakened. Allies distanced themselves. The protection that had once surrounded him thinned as the cost of association grew too high. His greatest vulnerability wasn't exposure, it was irrelevance. Power, once questioned, loses its ability to command unquestioned loyalty. She watched all of this from a distance. Not because she didn't care, but because she understood something most people didn't. Closure doesn't come from watching. Others fall. It comes from reclaiming what was taken from you. For her, that meant agency, choice, the freedom to decide what came next without reacting to someone else's control. She didn't stay where she was, not out of defeat, but intention. She left on her own terms, carrying skills, knowledge, and a quiet confidence she hadn't possessed before. The world hadn't suddenly become fair, but it had become less intimidating. She had seen the inside of power and learned it wasn't as unshakable as it pretended to be. Life didn't transform overnight. Bills still arrived. Responsibilities remained. But the fear that once shaped every decision no longer dominated her thinking. She pursued stability with a clarity rooted in experience rather than desperation. She made plans that extended beyond immediate survival, and for the first time, those plans felt realistic. Her story didn't become a headline. It became something more enduring, a reference point. A reminder whispered in hallways and remembered in meetings. Proof that silence wasn't the only option, and invisibility wasn't permanent. Her presence had forced a reckoning that couldn't be fully undone. The impact reached beyond institutions. It reshaped how she saw herself. She was no longer defined by what she endured, but by what she chose to confront. That shift changed everything. It affected how she moved through the world, how she set boundaries, how she taught her son to understand strength not as dominance, but as integrity under pressure. In the end, the most powerful consequence wasn't what happened to him. It was what happened to her. She reclaimed ownership of her narrative in a world that had tried to overwrite it. She proved that even within systems designed to protect the powerful, accountability could still find a way through. And as the story settled into its final shape, one truth remained undeniable. She had been underestimated because she was expected, but remained silent. Instead, she became the reason silence was no longer possible. If this story made you question how often power goes unchecked, don't stop here. Like, subscribe, and stay until the next story, because the most dangerous truths are the ones hiding in plain sight.